James Holloway left his family's farm, trusting that his legacy was safe, but when he returned, he found it stolen. The land his ancestors had fought for, the soil rich with history, had been erased beneath the towering glass and steel of a luxury hotel. Behind it all stood the Crestwood HOA, blinded by greed, convinced they had won. But what they didn't know was that James had set a trap long before they even started, and they had walked right into it. James Holloway inherited his family's farmland in Crestwood County, a quiet town that had once been a haven for hardworking families. His great-grandfather had purchased the land over a century ago, passing it down through generations, each owner adding to its legacy. The 50-acre property had fertile soil, open pastures, and a small farmhouse that stood as a reminder of the family's history. It wasn't just land, it was a symbol of resilience and perseverance. Crestwood County had changed over the years. What was once a rural farming community had transformed into a rapidly expanding suburban town. Large corporations saw potential in the area, bringing shopping centers, luxury homes, and high-end developments. Property values soared, and small-town charm slowly faded into a modern commercial district. James knew his land was valuable, but he never had any intention of selling. To him, it was more than just real estate. It was a part of his identity. As an entrepreneur, James traveled frequently for business. Before leaving on a 2-year trip overseas, he ensured his property taxes were paid in advance, filed all necessary paperwork to secure ownership, and even left legal protections in place. His farmland was fenced off, and a caretaker occasionally checked on the property. Confident that everything was in order, James departed without concern, unaware that the Homeowners Association had been plotting behind his back. The HOA of Crestwood was known for its aggressive expansion efforts. Originally created to maintain residential areas, it had grown into a powerful organization controlling zoning laws and influencing local government decisions. Their latest goal was to turn the town into a high-end destination, and James's farmland stood in their way. The land's location was perfect for their next big project, a luxury hotel and resort. The HOA began searching for loopholes that would allow them to seize the land. They argued that the property was abandoned, pointing to the fact that James had been gone for a long time. They manipulated local officials, forging documents that declared the land unclaimed and available for redevelopment. To the public, it appeared as though the land had never been properly registered, and the HOA took full advantage of this fabricated narrative. Within months, the transformation was underway. The fields were cleared, construction crews arrived, and towering steel beams replaced the quiet landscape. The once empty farmland quickly turned into the foundation of an extravagant hotel, complete with modern architecture, a lavish pool, and a grand lobby. Investors eagerly poured money into the project, believing it would become the crown jewel of Crestwood County. No one questioned the legitimacy of the project. The HOA was a trusted authority, and anyone who doubted them was silenced through intimidation or misinformation. As the hotel neared completion, the community celebrated its progress, unaware that the entire development stood on stolen land. The HOA had overlooked one crucial detail. James had outmaneuvered them long before they even started. While James was away, the HOA moved quickly to ensure their claim over the land remained unchallenged. They knew that if anyone questioned their authority, the entire operation could collapse. Their first move was to erase any trace of James's ownership from public records. With the help of a corrupt official in the county clerk's office, they altered property deeds, adjusted tax records, and filed fraudulent documents that made it appear as though the farmland had been unregistered for years. To reinforce their claim, they created a false history. They spread rumors that the Holloway family had long abandoned the land, that no one had stepped foot on it for decades, and that James was nothing more than a distant relative with no legal connection to the property. These fabrications were carefully fed to local news outlets, city officials, and residents, ensuring that no one would question the sudden development of the hotel. The next step was solidifying their legal control. The HOA worked with a group of high-powered attorneys who specialized in real estate acquisitions. Using a loophole in local laws, they filed a claim stating that the land was under their jurisdiction due to its proximity to HOA-controlled properties. With no opposition, their petition sailed through the system, and a fraudulent deed was issued in the HOA's name. By the time the first walls of the hotel were erected, James's name had been effectively scrubbed from every official record. The HOA held public meetings boasting about the economic benefits of the new development. They promised job opportunities, an increase in property values, and a transformed community. Residents who had once admired the open farmland were now convinced that the hotel was a necessary step toward progress. However, not everyone accepted the changes so easily. A retired journalist named Harold Boone, who had spent years documenting the history of Crestwood County, noticed inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. He remembered writing about the Holloway family's land years ago and was certain that James was still the legal owner. Something didn't add up. Harold began digging through old records, searching for any trace of James's property. At first, he was met with roadblocks. Files were missing, documents had been removed, and local offices refused to cooperate. But he was persistent. Eventually, in an archived newspaper article from a decade earlier, he found undeniable proof, a feature on James Holloway and his farmland, complete with photographs and legal references. Realizing he had uncovered something explosive, Harold attempted to contact state authorities, but before he could take further action, he vanished without a trace. His home was found ransacked, his research scattered across the floor, and his car abandoned near the county line. Local law enforcement dismissed the case as a possible accident or voluntary disappearance, but those who knew Harold suspected otherwise. With the hotel's grand opening approaching, the HOA was confident they had buried the truth forever. What they didn't know was that James was already on his way back home. James stepped off the plane with a sense of excitement. After 2 years overseas, he was eager to return to his family's land, breathe in the fresh air, and walk the familiar fields that had been in his family for generations. As his car neared Crestwood County, he looked forward to the peaceful solitude of his farmhouse. But the sight that greeted him was something he never could have expected. Where his farmland once stretched wide and open, a towering luxury hotel now stood. The pastures had been replaced with paved roads, neatly trimmed lawns, and a massive parking lot filled with expensive cars. Banners advertised the grand opening of Crestwood's newest five-star resort. Guests in elegant attire walked in and out of the glass doors, and workers rushed around making final preparations for a highly publicized launch event. James pulled over, staring at the scene in stunned silence. His mind raced through possibilities. Was he in the wrong place? Had something happened while he was gone? As he stepped out of his car and looked around, the realization hit him hard. His land had been taken. His family's history had been bulldozed, replaced by this monument of greed. But instead of reacting in anger or frustration, James remained eerily calm. He pulled out his phone and began going through his legal documents. Before leaving 2 years ago, he had made sure every deed, tax record, and ownership paper was properly filed. He knew that his land might be targeted one day, and he had taken extra precautions to ensure no one could take it from him. If someone had built this hotel, they had done so illegally. He wasn't just looking at stolen property, he was looking at a massive legal disaster waiting to unfold. James drove into town gathering information. He visited old friends and former colleagues, casually bringing up the hotel. From their responses, it became clear that the HOA had convinced everyone that the land was abandoned. They had presented fraudulent documents, manipulated local laws, and pushed through their agenda without any real opposition. Investors had poured millions into the project, believing it was a legitimate development. The entire town had been swept up in the excitement, never stopping to question the truth. James knew he had the upper hand, but he needed to be strategic. If he rushed into court too soon, the HOA might find a way to delay or cover up their fraud. Instead, he quietly gathered evidence, making copies of his original land deeds and tracking down key documents that had been altered. He reached out to legal experts, verifying that his ownership remained intact. Everything pointed to one inevitable conclusion: the hotel, the land, and everything on it still legally belonged to him. As the grand opening approached, James watched from a distance. The HOA had no idea they had walked straight into his trap. Soon, the entire town would find out the truth, and the consequences would be devastating. The grand opening of the Crestwood Luxury Hotel was the most anticipated event the town had seen in years. Investors, government officials, and wealthy guests arrived in expensive cars, ready to celebrate what they believed was a groundbreaking achievement for the community. The HOA members stood proudly at the entrance, shaking hands and giving speeches about how the hotel would bring prosperity to the town. Cameras flashed, reporters documented the occasion, and champagne flowed freely. But just as the festivities reached their peak, an unexpected guest arrived, James Holloway. He walked through the crowd unnoticed at first, taking in the scene. Everything built on the land was extravagant, from the towering glass windows to the marble floors inside the lobby. The HOA had spared no expense, confident that they had secured their place as the most powerful entity in Crestwood. That confidence was about to be shattered. James had spent the last few weeks preparing for this moment. With legal documents in hand, he walked straight past the reception desk and into the main ballroom where the town's most influential figures had gathered. He approached the podium and, without hesitation, placed a thick file of papers in front of the HOA president. The man's smile faltered as he flipped through the documents, realizing what he was looking at. Undeniable proof that James was still the legal owner of the land. The room fell silent as James calmly explained the situation. The hotel had been built on property that was never legally transferred. Every dollar invested, every contract signed, every business deal made under the assumption that the land belonged to the HOA was now worthless. The ownership had never changed hands, and by law, everything constructed on the property still belonged to him. Panic spread through the crowd. Investors demanded answers. Reporters scrambled to capture the unfolding disaster. The HOA members, once so smug and powerful, stood frozen in shock. Some tried to argue, but James had come prepared. He presented documents proving the fraudulent transactions, exposing the forged signatures, and revealing the illegal zoning changes that had allowed the construction to take place. It wasn't long before law enforcement stepped in. State officials launched an immediate investigation, uncovering even more corruption within the HOA. They found evidence of bribery, tax evasion, and falsified records. One by one, the people responsible for the scheme were taken into custody. The president of the HOA, along with several board members, was arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. Investors who had poured millions into the project realized they had been deceived and began filing lawsuits, leading to financial ruin for those involved. The Crestwood Luxury Hotel, which had been the pride of the HOA, was now at the center of a massive legal scandal. The grand opening had turned into a public disgrace. James had not only reclaimed what was rightfully his, but he had also dismantled the corrupt system that had tried to steal it. And the consequences for those responsible were only just beginning. With the HOA dismantled and its corrupt leaders facing criminal charges, the once celebrated Crestwood Luxury Hotel became a symbol of greed and deception. Investors who had once seen it as a gold mine now abandoned it, cutting their losses as lawsuits piled up. The town, once blinded by the promise of economic growth, was now left in shock, realizing they had cheered for a project built on lies. But for James Holloway, this was just the beginning. Legally, the land, and everything on it, belonged to him. The towering hotel, the lavish amenities, and every inch of the property were now under his full control. Many assumed he would sell the hotel to recover damages or demolish it to restore his farmland. But James had a different vision, one that would turn the entire situation into something meaningful. Instead of seeking revenge or quick profits, James decided to transform the hotel into something that would benefit the very people the HOA had ignored. He announced plans to convert the massive structure into affordable housing, business incubators, and community spaces. The luxury suites would become apartments for struggling families. The once exclusive restaurants would serve as culinary training centers, and the ballroom that once hosted Crestwood's elite would now host job fairs and local events. At first, many were skeptical. Could a place designed for the wealthy be repurposed for the people? But as James put his plan into motion, the town began to rally behind him. Volunteers stepped up to help with renovations, local businesses offered support, and donors who had initially backed the hotel saw an opportunity to invest in something more impactful. What had once been a monument to corruption was now being rebuilt into a hub of opportunity. News of James's victory spread beyond Crestwood, drawing national attention. Reporters who had covered the scandal now returned to tell a different story, one of resilience, justice, and community empowerment. Legal experts called it one of the most remarkable cases of land reclamation in modern history. Activists praised James for turning a moment of betrayal into a movement for change. Meanwhile, the former HOA members faced severe consequences. Some received lengthy prison sentences for their roles in the fraud, while others were financially ruined by lawsuits. The once powerful organization that had controlled Crestwood for years was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Months later, as James stood on what was once his family's farmland, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The landscape had changed, but the legacy remained intact. His ancestors had fought to build a future on this land, and now he was doing the same in his own way. The hotel that had been stolen from him was no longer a mark of injustice, it was a testament to perseverance. The HOA had fallen into their own trap, never realizing that James had outmaneuvered them long before they had even begun. Justice had been served, not just in the courts, but in the way he chose to rebuild what they had tried to take from him.